All characters in the story are over the age of 18. When my dad introduced me to Eva, I wasn't sure what to think. He'd been single for years after my mom passed, and I couldn't blame him for wanting to move on. But Eva, she wasn't like the women he usually dated. She was younger, for one thing, only 34 to his 50, and she had this sharp wit and charm that made her stand out. I was 22 at the time, living at home while finishing my last year of college. The first time I met her, she gave me this easy smile and said, "So, you're the infamous Caleb? Your dad talks about you all the time." I chuckled nervously. "Hope it's all good things." "Mostly," she teased, her green eyes sparkling. From that moment, something about her drew me in. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a passing crush. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to look away. Dad and Eva got married a few months later in a small ceremony at a local vineyard. She moved into the house with us, and suddenly, she was everywhere. Her laughter echoing through the halls, her perfume lingering in the air. At first, I did my best to keep my distance. She was my dad's wife, after all. But the way she'd laugh at my jokes, or the way her gaze lingered just a little too long, made it impossible to ignore the growing tension between us. It happened one night when Dad was away on a business trip. Eva and I were sitting in the living room, sharing a pizza and watching some forgettable action movie. I couldn't stop stealing glances at her. How her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders. How her lips curved into a smile whenever something ridiculous happened on screen. "Do you always eat pizza with a fork?" she asked, raising an eyebrow at me. I laughed, feeling a little self-conscious. "It's less messy," she smirked, grabbing a slice with her hands. "You're missing the point, Caleb. Half the fun is the mess." Before I could respond, a bit of sauce dripped onto her chin. She laughed, wiping it away with her thumb. Something about the moment felt intimate. "Do I have something on my face?" she teased, catching me staring. I looked away quickly, my cheeks burning. "No, you're good." The tension between us hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. When the movie ended, she leaned back on the couch, her eyes meeting mine. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her tone suddenly serious. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong here?" Her question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, her gaze distant. "I don't know. Your dad's always so busy. And this house, it just feels empty sometimes." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah, I guess I know what you mean." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then, without thinking, I reached out and took her hand. She looked down at our intertwined fingers, her expression unreadable. "Eva, I started, but the words caught in my throat. She leaned in slightly, her eyes searching mine. "Caleb, we can't," she whispered. But even as she said it, her hand tightened around mine. The sound of the front door unlocking snapped us out of the moment. We jumped apart as Dad walked in, setting his briefcase down by the door. "Hey, you too," he said, oblivious to the charged atmosphere. "What did I miss?" "Not much," Eva said quickly, her voice steady. "Just a movie and some pizza." I forced a smile, my heart racing. As Dad launched into a story about his trip, I couldn't focus on a word he was saying. All I could think about was the way Eva had looked at me, and the feeling that something between us had shifted. After that night, everything felt different. Eva and I avoided talking about what had happened, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch, felt electric. I tried to distract myself by spending more time with my friends or burying myself in schoolwork, but nothing worked. Eva was always there. At the breakfast table, in the living room, her presence a constant reminder of the growing divide between what I wanted and what I knew was right. One afternoon, Dad asked me to help him clean out the garage. Eva joined us, wearing a pair of old jeans and a tank top that left little to the imagination. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my eyes kept drifting to her. At one point, she caught me staring. Instead of looking away, she gave me a small, knowing smile. My face burned, and I quickly turned back to organizing boxes. Later, as Dad went inside to take a phone call, Eva and I found ourselves alone. "You've been quiet lately," she said, leaning against the workbench. "Just busy," I replied, avoiding her gaze. She said, her tone teasing. "You sure it's not something else?" I glanced at her, and for a moment, the words were on the tip of my tongue. But before I could say anything, Dad's voice called out from the house, breaking the spell. After that night, everything felt different. Eva and I avoided talking about what had happened, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch, felt electric. I tried to distract myself by spending more time with my friends or burying myself in schoolwork, but nothing worked. Eva was always there. At the breakfast table, in the living room, her presence a constant reminder of the growing divide between what I wanted and what I knew was right. One afternoon, Dad asked me to help him clean out the garage. Eva joined us, wearing a pair of old jeans and a tank top that left little to the imagination. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my eyes kept drifting to her. At one point, she caught me staring. Instead of looking away, she gave me a small, knowing smile. My face burned, and I quickly turned back to organizing boxes. Later, as Dad went inside to take a phone call, Eva and I found ourselves alone. "You've been quiet lately," she said, leaning against the workbench. "Just busy," I replied, avoiding her gaze. She said, her tone teasing. "You sure it's not something else?" I glanced at her, and for a moment, the words were on the tip of my tongue. But before I could say anything, Dad's voice called out from the house, breaking the spell. After that night, everything changed. Eva and I both knew what we were doing was wrong, but the connection between us was undeniable. We tried to act normal around Dad, but every glance we shared, every brush of hands, felt like a secret waiting to spill over. Our first stolen moment happened just a few days later. Dad had gone to run errands, and Eva and I were left alone in the house. I was in the kitchen when she came in, her hair damp from a shower, wearing a casual sundress that clung to her figure. "Morning," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes betrayed the tension between us. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She moved closer, her bare feet soft against the tile. "Caleb, about the other night." "What about it?" I asked, my heart pounding. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "I can't stop thinking about it." I didn't know how to respond. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my hand brushing against hers. The next thing I knew, we were kissing again, the world outside the kitchen disappearing. But before things could go further, the sound of the garage door opening brought us crashing back to reality. "Dad's home," she whispered, her voice tinged with panic. We jumped apart, both of us scrambling to look innocent as Dad walked in. He didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary, but my heart didn't stop racing until long after he went upstairs. That night, Eva texted me for the first time. "We need to be more careful." "Agreed," I replied, though I knew being careful wouldn't make this any easier. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered conversations. Eva and I became experts at sneaking around, sharing secret touches in the hallway, meeting late at night when Dad was asleep. But no matter how careful we were, it was only a matter of time before someone noticed. One evening, Dad invited me and Eva to join him for dinner at a local restaurant. We spent the evening laughing and talking, but the tension between me and Eva was impossible to ignore. At one point, Dad excused himself to take a phone call, leaving us alone at the table. "You're staring," Eva said, her tone teasing. "Can you blame me?" I replied, unable to keep the smile off my face. She blushed, glancing around nervously. "Caleb, stop. Someone might see." Before I could respond, Dad returned to the table. "Sorry about that," he said, sitting down with a sigh. "Work never stops, huh?" We both nodded, doing our best to act normal. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dad was watching us more closely than usual. The next day, he cornered me in the living room. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his tone casual but his expression serious. Sure, I replied, though my stomach twisted with unease. You and Eva seem to be getting along really well, he said. Almost too well. I froze, my mind racing. What do you mean? He shrugged, but his eyes never left mine. I don't know. Just seems like there's something going on I should know about. There's nothing going on, I said quickly, forcing a laugh. She's your wife, Dad. I'd never. He held up a hand, cutting me off. Relax, Caleb. I'm just saying be careful. I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea. I nodded, my heart pounding. But as he walked away, I couldn't help but feel like he was onto us. That night, Eva and I met in the backyard, away from the house and prying eyes. Your dad's suspicious, I told her, my voice low. What did he say? She asked, her expression tense. Just that we seem too close. She bit her lip, her eyes filled with worry. What are we going to do? I reached out, taking her hand in mine. We'll figure it out. But we need to be more careful. She nodded, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Eva and I tried to act normal after Dad's subtle confrontation, but the weight of his suspicions hung over us. Every interaction felt like it was being scrutinized, and every stolen moment was laced with tension. One evening, I found myself alone in the living room, scrolling aimlessly on my phone. Eva walked in, her face pale and tense. We need to talk, she said, sitting down beside me. What's wrong? I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling in my gut. Your dad mentioned something today, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He said he feels like I'm distant. What did you say? I told him I've just been stressed with work, she replied, rubbing her temples. But I think he knows something's off. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Do you think he suspects us? She hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know, but we need to be more careful, Caleb. If he finds out. Her voice trailed off, but the unspoken consequences hung heavy in the air. I reached over, taking her hand in mine. We'll be fine, I promise. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. I hope you're right, she whispered. As the weeks went on, the strain of keeping our secret began to take its toll. Eva and I were still stealing moments together, but the paranoia was growing. Every time Dad glanced at us, I felt like he could see right through me. One evening, while Dad was working late, Eva and I found ourselves alone in the house again. We tried to keep things casual, but the tension was palpable. As we sat in the kitchen, she suddenly reached out and placed her hand over mine. Caleb, I can't keep doing this, she said, her voice trembling. What do you mean? I asked, though I already knew. She sighed, looking away. The sneaking around, the constant fear. It's too much. I feel like we're going to get caught any second. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. Eva, I know it's hard, but I can't give you up. I don't want to. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, the fear melted away. I don't want to give you up either, she admitted. Before either of us could say anything else, we heard the sound of the garage door opening. Dad's home, I said quickly, pulling my hand away. Eva stood up, smoothing her hair and taking a deep breath. By the time Dad walked into the kitchen, she was pouring herself a glass of water, looking perfectly calm. Hey, you too, he said, setting his bag down. What's for dinner? Leftovers, Eva replied, her tone light and casual. I forced a smile, but my heart was racing. Every interaction felt like a ticking time bomb, and I didn't know how much longer we could keep this up. Later that night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed with a message from Eva. I think your dad knows. The words sent a chill down my spine. The message from Eva haunted me all night. I think your dad knows. I stared at the screen, rereading it until the words blurred together. Could he really know? Or was it just our paranoia catching up with us? The next morning, Dad acted normal, too normal. He sat at the breakfast table, reading the paper like nothing was wrong, but I caught him stealing glances at me and Eva when he thought we weren't looking. Big plans today? He asked casually, his eyes darting between us. Just work, Eva replied, her tone steady. And I might run some errands later. I nodded along. Same here, class, then probably the library. Dad didn't press further, but his silence spoke volumes. That evening, Eva pulled me aside when Dad was in the shower. We need to be careful, she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I think he's watching us. What do you mean? I asked, my stomach twisting. Yesterday, he mentioned how we've been spending a lot of time together. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell he's suspicious. Do you think he saw something? I don't know, she said, her voice trembling. But we can't risk it. For the next few days, we kept our distance, barely speaking or even looking at each other when Dad was around. It was torture, but I knew it was necessary. Then, one night, everything came to a head. It was late, and the house was quiet. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a soft knock at my door. Caleb. Eva's voice was barely audible. I opened the door to find her standing there, her face pale. What's wrong? Your dad's asleep, she said, stepping inside. We need to talk. She sat on the edge of my bed, her hands fidgeting nervously. I can't keep doing this, she said, her voice trembling. It's not just the fear of getting caught. It's the guilt. Guilt? I asked, sitting beside her. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Your dad. He's been so good to me, and I'm betraying him. We're betraying him. I reached out, taking her hand in mine. Eva, I know this is hard, but what we have, it's real. You can't deny that. I don't deny it, she said, her voice breaking. But that doesn't make it right. Before I could respond, we heard a noise from the hallway. My blood ran cold as the door creaked open, revealing Dad standing there, his face a mask of shock and anger. What the hell is going on? He demanded, his voice shaking. I froze, my mind racing for an explanation. But Eva was quicker. I couldn't sleep, she said, standing up. I came to ask Caleb for advice about work. Dad's eyes narrowed, his gaze darting between us. At midnight. It's not what you think, I said quickly, but my voice lacked conviction. He stared at us for what felt like an eternity before finally shaking his head. We'll talk about this tomorrow, he said, his tone cold. As he walked away, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Eva turned to me, her face pale. What do we do now? I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. But deep down, I knew the truth. The secret we'd fought so hard to protect was about to unravel. The next morning, the tension in the house was unbearable. Dad barely looked at either of us during breakfast. He sat stiffly at the head of the table, silently sipping his coffee while Eva and I avoided each other's gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was icy. Eva, Caleb, I think we need to have a family meeting tonight. Eva's hand trembled as she set down her cup. What's this about? You'll find out, he said curtly, standing and leaving the room. The rest of the day passed in a haze of dread. I tried texting Eva, but she didn't respond. Every possible scenario played out in my head. What he might say, what he might do if he had figured out the truth. That evening, we gathered in the living room. Dad sat in his usual chair, his expression unreadable, while Eva and I perched on opposite ends of the couch. I've been noticing some things, Dad began, his tone measured but tense. You two have been acting differently lately, closer. And last night, he trailed off, his gaze hardening. Dad, it's not what you think, I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Then explain it to me, he snapped. I looked at Eva, silently pleading for help, but she stared at the floor, her face pale. It's my fault, she said finally, her voice trembling. I've been struggling with adjusting to everything. Caleb's just been a friend to me, someone to talk to. Is that all it is? Dad asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Yes, she lied, her voice barely audible. He studied us for a long moment, then nodded. Fine, but I don't want any more late-night visits or private talks. Do I make myself clear? Yes. We both murmured, relief and fear washing over me in equal measure. As soon as the meeting ended, Eva disappeared into the bedroom. I wanted to follow her, to comfort her, but I knew it was too risky. For the next week, Eva and I kept our distance. Every interaction felt like walking on eggshells, and the house was thick with unspoken tension. Then one night, everything came crashing down. I was in my room, trying to focus on a textbook, when I heard shouting from the hallway. "How could you?" Dad's voice roared, shaking the walls. My heart dropped as I rushed out of my room. He was standing in the living room, his face red with anger, holding Eva's phone in his hand. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Care to explain this?" he demanded, shoving the phone toward me. I glanced at the screen, and my stomach sank. It was a text conversation between Eva and me, one that left no doubt about what had been going on. "I trusted you," Dad said, his voice breaking. "Both of you." "Dad, I began, but he cut me off. "Don't," he snapped. "Just don't. How long has this been going on?" I hesitated, glancing at Eva, but she couldn't meet my eyes. "Months," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Dad's face twisted with rage. "Get out," he said, pointing at the door. "Dad, please." I said, "Get out," he bellowed. I grabbed my keys and left, my mind racing as I drove aimlessly through the city. I didn't know where to go, what to do. All I knew was that I had destroyed the one family I'd ever had. That night, I stayed at a friend's house. When I finally worked up the courage to return the next day, the house was eerily quiet. Eva was gone. Dad barely looked at me as he said, "She left this morning. And if you have any decency, you'll do the same." His words were like a knife to the heart, but I knew he was right. I packed my things and left that afternoon. Leaving the house felt like stepping into a void. I drove aimlessly for hours, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me like a boulder. My phone buzzed several times with calls and texts from friends, but I ignored them all. Finally, I parked in an empty lot and sat in silence. I couldn't stop replaying the moment Dad discovered our secret, the look of betrayal on his face, Eva's tearful confession. Where had she gone? I had so many questions, but no way to find answers. I eventually checked into a cheap motel, unable to bear the thought of facing anyone I knew. That night, I stared at the cracked ceiling, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. The next few weeks were a blur. I stayed with a friend for a while, trying to figure out my next move. I managed to land a part-time job at a local coffee shop and found a small apartment I could afford with my limited income. Eva was a ghost in my life. I didn't know where she was, and she didn't reach out. Part of me wanted to find her, but another part knew it was better this way. Dad didn't speak to me again. I tried calling him once, but he didn't answer. The voicemail I left, an apology I poured my heart into, went unanswered. One evening, as I was finishing my shift at the coffee shop, I saw her. Eva was sitting at a corner table, staring out the window. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, and she seemed tired, but it was unmistakably her. My heart leapt into my throat as I approached her. "Eva," I said softly. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise. "Caleb." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit." I slid into the chair, my hands trembling. "I didn't think I'd see you again." "I didn't think I'd see you either," she admitted, her voice quiet. "How have you been?" I asked, unsure of where to start. She shrugged. "Surviving. I've been staying with a friend, trying to figure things out." "Me too," I said. "I moved out. Got a job, a place of my own." She nodded, her gaze dropping to the table. "I'm sorry, Caleb, for everything." "You don't have to apologize," I said. "I'm just as much to blame." We talked for hours, catching up on everything we'd missed. She told me how she'd left the house that morning, not knowing where she was going, and how she'd been staying under the radar ever since. "I still think about you," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I think about you too," I said, my heart aching. The coffee shop began to close and we stepped outside. The air was cool, and the streetlights cast a warm glow over the quiet street. "What now?" she asked, looking up at me. "I don't know," I admitted. But I don't want to lose you again. She smiled faintly. We'll figure it out. Together. After that night at the coffee shop, Eva and I cautiously started rebuilding our connection. We met in secret, talking for hours about everything that had happened and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The weight of our past lingered between us, but so did the undeniable bond we shared. One evening, as we sat on a park bench overlooking the city, Eva broke the silence. "Caleb, I don't think we can keep doing this," she said, her voice trembling. I froze, my chest tightening. "What do you mean?" It's not sustainable," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "Your dad will never forgive us, and I don't want to keep living in the shadows." I reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "Eva, I don't care about what anyone else thinks. I want to be with you." She shook her head, her tears falling freely. "I want that too, Caleb, but look at what we've already lost. Your relationship with your dad, my life as I knew it. It's all gone. How much more are we willing to sacrifice?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right. We had already destroyed so much, and the path we were on only promised more pain. "Then what do we do?" I asked, my voice breaking. She took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "We let each other go." "No," I said, shaking my head. "There has to be another way." "Caleb," she said softly, her voice filled with sorrow. "Sometimes love isn't enough." The words cut deep, but I could see the resolve in her eyes. She had made up her mind. The next day, Eva left town. She didn't tell me where she was going, and I didn't ask. Saying goodbye was the hardest thing I'd ever done. But I knew she was right. Our love, as intense and real as it was, came with too high a price. I spent weeks grappling with the emptiness she left behind. My apartment felt cold and hollow, a stark reminder of everything I had lost. One afternoon, I decided to visit Dad. I wasn't sure if he would even let me in, but I knew I had to try. When he opened the door, his expression was unreadable. "Caleb," he said, his voice stiff. "Hey, Dad," I said, my heart pounding. "Can we talk?" He hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. We sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed your trust, and I'll never forgive myself for that." He stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I won't lie, Caleb. What you did, what you both did, it broke me. But you're still my son." His words brought tears to my eyes. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," he said, his voice softening. "But I've lost enough already. I don't want to lose you too."